I want to tell you what the word done sounds like when a person says it and means every letter. Daniel said it in a hotel corridor on our wedding night. He said it to his mother. He had just come back from a conversation in that corridor that had lasted 4 minutes, and he had come back to me at our table and he had taken my hand and he had said, "Done." And the specific quality of that one word on that evening was the most complete thing I have heard in 7 years of knowing him. Let me tell you what the 4 minutes were built on. The 4 minutes in the corridor were built on 3 hours and 40 minutes of a wedding that had been, by every measure except one, exactly what we had planned. The ceremony, the photographs, the food at the reception, my dress that I had spent 8 months choosing and had found 6 weeks before the wedding, in a small shop on a side street, and which was exactly the shape I had always known it should be. Daniel's face at the end of the aisle when I came through the door. These things were real, and they happened. And I am not going to let the one exception erase them. But the exception was also real, and it also happened. And this is the account of what it was. And how it resolved, and why the word done is the most important word of the day. My name is Sophie. I am 31 years old. Daniel is 33. We had been together for 6 years before the wedding. I had known Barbara, his mother, for 6 years. In those 6 years I had understood 3 things about Barbara. The first, she loved Daniel with a complete and genuine devotion that was not in question. The second, she had a specific and long-standing attachment to the version of Daniel's life that had existed before me, which included a relationship with a woman named Melissa that had ended 2 years before Daniel and I met. The third, she had a way of acting on what she believed that did not require anyone else's agreement or awareness. Those 3 things together produced the event of the wedding evening, and I want to give you the event in the order in which I received it, so that you understand not just what happened, but how it is to find out, on your wedding day, that the third thing is larger than you had previously estimated. The cocktail hour. I was not at the cocktail hour. I want to be clear about this because the timing is what made the event possible. The ceremony had finished at 4:15. The cocktail hour was 4:30 to 5:30. I was not in the cocktail room during the cocktail hour because the photographer had arranged for the bridal party photographs to take place in the garden during that window, in the specific light of a late afternoon in September that she had assessed and described as the best available and, which was, I have to say, exactly that. The photographs were beautiful. I was in the garden from 4:30 to 5:15 with Daniel and our families and the photographer, and the best man and my maid of honor, Claire, and I was not in the cocktail room. The cocktail room had approximately 80 guests in it during those 45 minutes. In the cocktail room, there was a projector. The projector had been arranged by our wedding coordinator for the slideshow of photographs that Daniel and I had prepared over 2 weeks in January, which was a collection of images of our relationship from the first photograph we ever took together through to the engagement photographs and the year before the wedding. It was a document of us, our faces in different years, different places. It was supposed to run on a loop during the cocktail hour while guests had their drinks. Our wedding coordinator had given the slideshow to the venue's AV team on a USB stick the previous Tuesday. What the venue's AV team received on the morning of the wedding, from Barbara, was a second USB stick. Barbara had arrived at the venue at 10 in the morning, 4 hours before the ceremony, under the stated purpose of helping with the flower arrangements. She had found the AV technician, and she had given him the USB stick, and she had said, "This is some additional content for the slideshow." She had said, "It is from the family." She had said, "Please add it to the existing slideshow." He had added it to the loop. He had not reviewed the content in detail. He had added it, and the slideshow had played on a loop in the cocktail room for 45 minutes, while 80 guests had their drinks and Daniel and I were in the garden in the September light, with the best photographs of our relationship. The additional content was 16 images. 12 of them were photographs of Daniel as a child and as a teenager that were in themselves unremarkable and that I would not have objected to. 4 of them were photographs from Daniel's relationship with Melissa. The first, Daniel and Melissa at a dinner. The second, Daniel and Melissa at what appeared to be a holiday, a beach, bright light, both of them laughing. The third, Daniel and Melissa at a family occasion, seated at a table. Barbara on one side of Melissa, Daniel on the other. The fourth, Melissa alone, looking at the camera, smiling. A portrait-style photograph that was not a candid. A photograph that had been specifically taken and specifically selected and specifically added to a slideshow that was playing on a loop in the cocktail room of our wedding while 80 of our guests had their drinks. I did not know any of this was happening. I was in the garden. I was in the best light of the best afternoon. I found out at 5:40. We had come in from the garden at 5:15, and there had been the movement of seating and greeting, and the specific pleasant chaos of 90 guests finding their tables. I had been speaking to my aunt. Claire had appeared at my elbow. She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Now?" She said, "Yes." She said it in the tone she uses when a thing cannot wait, and I stepped away from my aunt, and I looked at Claire, and she said, "The slideshow during cocktails." She said, "Someone added photos to it." She said, "There were photos of Melissa in it." She said, 3 photos with Daniel and 1 of just her. She said, "I counted." She said it precisely because Claire is precise by nature, and she knew I would want the count. She said, "I am telling you before you hear it from anyone else." I said, "Who put them in?" She said, "I don't know." She said, "I asked the AV guy. He said a family member gave him a USB this morning and told him to add it to the slideshow." I said, "Barbara." Claire said nothing. She did not need to. I stood at the edge of the seating area of my own wedding reception. I was wearing the dress I had spent 8 months choosing. My husband was across the room talking to his cousin, laughing, unaware. 80 people had watched 4 photographs of his previous relationship on a loop for 45 minutes in the cocktail room. On our wedding day. I need to tell you what I did, because what I did is the part of this story that I am most proud of, and the part that I want to be the record of who I am on the most important day of my life. I crossed the room. I went to Daniel. I said, "I need to show you something." I did not say it urgently or coldly. I said it in the normal voice I use when I have information that needs to be shared. He said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Nothing is wrong." I said, "I need you to come with me for a moment." We stepped to the side of the room. I told him what Claire had told me. I gave him the count. 3 with him, 1 of her alone. I told him it was a USB given to the AV team this morning. I said, "I believe it was your mother." He went very still. He said, "Stay here." He said it gently. He said, "I mean that literally." He said, "Stand right here. Don't move. I will be back." He went to the AV technician. He was gone 8 minutes. He came back. He said, "It was her USB." He showed it to me. The stick was labelled in handwriting I recognized as Barbara's. He said, "I've asked them to remove it from the queue." He said, "It will not show again tonight." He said, "I need to speak to her." I said, "Okay." He said, "I need to do this alone." I said, "Okay." He said, "And I need you to trust me." I said, "I trust you. I have always trusted you." He said, "I know." He went to find Barbara. I stood at the side of the room. I stood in the dress. I waited. Let me tell you what Daniel told me afterward about the 4 minutes in the corridor. He found Barbara at her table. He said, "Come with me for a moment." She came. They went into the corridor outside the reception room. He said, I know about the USB. She said the thing they all say in the moment they are found. I just wanted some family memories in the slideshow. He said, with 3 photographs of Melissa in them. She was quiet. He said, I am going to say one thing. He said, and I need you to hear it completely. He said, I got married today. He said, I married Sophie. He said, and you, on this day, added photographs of a woman I was with 4 years ago to the slideshow at our reception. He said, without asking me. He said, without asking Sophie. He said, on the specific occasion that we had planned for 18 months. He said, I do not want to have a long conversation tonight. He said, I want to go back to my wife. He said, and I need you to understand that from this moment, the way you treat my marriage is the thing that determines the shape of your relationship with both of us. He said, that is not a threat. He said, it is a clear statement. He said, I am not angry in a way that requires something from you tonight. He said, I am clear in a way that I have not been clear before about what is acceptable. He said, the speech you arranged with the MC is cancelled. He said, there will be no speech from you tonight. She said, I just wanted to say something about. He said, no. One word. Not cold. Not loud. No. He said, sit with Dad for the rest of the evening. He said good night. He came back. He crossed the reception room. He reached me. He took my hand. He said, done. I said, really? He said, yes. I said, are you okay? He said, I got married today. He said, that is everything. He was right. We went back to the table. The speeches were the best man, who told a story about Daniel on a camping trip that made the room laugh for 3 minutes without pause, and my brother James, who said, I have known Sophie for 31 years and I have known exactly who she was going to be since she was 8 years old. He said, I have been watching her become it ever since. He said, Daniel, you are the specific right person for the specific right person. He raised his glass. The room raised their glasses. That was the toast. That was the speech that existed and was given, and that is what the room heard. Barbara sat with her husband. She did not speak to me for the rest of the evening. I did not speak to her. I danced with my father and my mother and my brother and Claire, and with Daniel. Once, slowly, near the end of the night, in the middle of the floor with the room around us and the lights low. That dance exists. That is the real record of the evening. I want to tell you about the speech she had prepared, because the MC gave Daniel the speech notes the next morning, when we were checking out, and said, I was asked to deliver this last night, and when the speech was cancelled the notes were left with me. He said, I thought you should have them. He handed them to Daniel. Daniel read them in the hotel room while I was packing. He said, I'm going to tell you what is in here. I said, okay. He said, it is 8 pages. I said, okay. He said, it is structured as a tribute to my childhood and my character. He said, there are 6 mentions of Melissa by name. He said, there is a photograph she had arranged to display on the projector at a specific moment during the speech, a large one of me and Melissa from a holiday. He said, the final line is, I just want Daniel to know that I will always love him, no matter what direction his life takes. He said, no matter what direction his life takes. Not, no matter who he loves. Not, and I welcome Sophie into our family. He said, what direction his life takes, as though he had taken a direction that required unconditional love as a response, rather than celebration. I said, she planned all of that for tonight. He said, yes. He said, 8 pages. I said, She wrote 8 pages, he said. Yes. I said, she wrote 8 pages and arranged a photograph on the projector and added 4 photos to the cocktail. Slideshow and arranged with the MC to give a speech after the best man. He said, all of it. I said, I want you to know something. He said, yes. I said, none of that happened. He was quiet. I said, the speech did not happen. He said, no. I said, no one heard the 8 pages. He said, no. I said, the dance happened. He said, yes. I said, your best man's story happened. He said, yes. I said, James's toast happened. He said, yes. I said, those are the things that are in the record of the evening. He said, yes. He held the 8 pages for a moment. Then he put them in the hotel bin. He said, I want to say something. He said, I have spent a long time understanding my mother as a person who loves me and who has difficulty with the love she has for me, producing behavior that respects my choices. He said, last night I was clearer than I have ever been about where that ends. He said, I drew the line in a corridor outside a reception room on our wedding night. He said, and I came back to you. I said, yes. He said, that is the direction my life takes. I said, yes. He said, she was wrong about everything except the love. I said, I know. He said, the love is real. He said, the way she acts on it is not acceptable. He said, I understand both things to be true. I said, yes. He said, we are going on our honeymoon tomorrow. I said, yes. He said, and the corridor conversation is the last time I am going to spend energy on this on holiday. I said, I know. He said, I just wanted you to have that. I said, I do. We took the train to the airport the next morning. The 8 pages were in the bin. The dance existed. The toast existed. The word done existed. That is what we took with us. I want to tell you about Barbara's history, because the USB was not the first thing. It was the most calculated thing, and it was the thing that produced the corridor conversation. But it was not the first indication. Let me give you the sequence so you have the full picture of what the corridor conversation was built on. Year 1 of our relationship. Barbara had asked Daniel twice whether he and Melissa had stayed in touch. He had said no. She had nodded in the way she nodded when information did not satisfy her. Year 2. At Christmas, Barbara had told the story of a trip she and Daniel and Melissa had taken together 3 years earlier in a way that was specific and detailed, and addressed to the room as though the 3 of them were still a unit that had shared the experience. Daniel had said once, gently, Mum. She had continued the story. Year 3. Barbara had sent Daniel an article about a charity event. The article mentioned Melissa, who worked in that sector. Barbara's message accompanying the article said, doesn't this look like something you'd enjoy? Not, I thought this charity was interesting. The article featuring Melissa's name and photograph had been selected and sent with a covering note. Year 4, which was the year before the wedding. At his birthday dinner, Barbara had said to the table apropos of nothing immediately preceding it, Melissa is apparently doing very well. She said, I saw her mother at the post office. She said, she is living in Edinburgh now. She said, very happy from what her mother says. She said it to the table. She did not address it to Daniel. She said it to the air of the room in the specific way of information that is for everyone, because it is for one person. Daniel had said, that is good to hear. He had said it flatly. He had moved the conversation. Barbara had let it be moved. She had said what she needed to say. Year 5 was the wedding year. The USB was the concentrated form of everything that had come before it. All the articles and stories and post office reports and Christmas trip narratives had been rehearsals. The USB was the performance. 8 pages and a photograph on a projector, and 4 images in a slideshow, and a final line about the direction his life takes. All of it prepared and brought to the most public occasion of our lives. Daniel, when I told him the full sequence I had been quietly tracking since year 1, went quiet. He said, "I knew about some of it." He said, "I didn't know you had been tracking it." I said, "I had been tracking it in the specific way of someone who hopes she is wrong about what she is seeing." He said, "Were you wrong?" I said, "The USB is a fair answer to that question." He said, "I have spent a long time hoping she would find her way to accepting us." I said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong to let the hoping replace the having the conversation." I said, "Yes." He said, "The corridor was the conversation I should have been having since year 2. I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "The structure now is what I should have established earlier." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am doing it now." I said, "Yes." He said, "Does the sequence you have been keeping make you angry?" I said, "Yes." "Good. Good." He said, "The anger is accurate." He said, "Hold on to the accuracy." He said, "Let the anger do what it needs to do and then let the structure be what holds it." I said, "That is the most sensible thing." He said, "I learned it from watching you stand in the middle of the reception in your dress, being told about the USB, and going to find me rather than going to find Barbara." I said, "I didn't want that to be the record of my wedding." He said, "I know." He said, "It isn't." I said, "No." He said, "The dance is." I said, "Yes, the dance, the toast, the word done. That is the record of the wedding. The USB is in the bin. The book is in the box with the wedding photographs. The sequence I tracked for 5 years is in this story, told to you. The structure is in place. The dance exists. That is the whole and complete account of what happened and what is happening now. I want to tell you about the guests, because 80 people saw those 4 photographs on a loop, and I have had to live with the question of what they thought and whether they knew, and what they understood in the room. During the cocktail hour when the slideshow was showing the wrong images, Claire told me what she had witnessed. She said, "People noticed." She said, "The first time the photographs appeared in the loop, some people did not register what they were seeing." She said, "The second time around, people understood." She said, "She saw people exchange glances." She said, "She saw Daniel's aunt nudge her husband." She said, "She saw one of your colleagues from work look at the photograph and look at the exit, and look at the photograph again." She said, "No one said anything." She said, "It was the specific silence of a room that has collectively received information that no one knows what to do with." I said, "How long did it play?" She said, "As far as she could tell from the timing, it cycled through the full slideshow approximately 3 times before we came in from the garden." She said, "So each photograph appeared 3 times. I sat with that. 3 times. 80 guests. 3 cycles. The portrait of Melissa appeared 3 times in the cocktail room of my wedding. I want to tell you how I received this information, in the large sense. Not the emotional reception, which I have already given you, but the cognitive one. I am a person who organizes information. It is how I work professionally, and how I process privately. I made a list in my head of what was true. True. 80 people saw it. True. No one said anything to us until Claire told me. True. The AV team added it without reviewing the content. True. Barbara was at the venue at 10 in the morning and found the AV technician. True. She had prepared 8 pages. True. The speech did not happen. True. Daniel found out before the speech. True. He went to the corridor. True. He came back. True. He said done. I made the list and I held it. And I understood that the list was the full shape of the event. All of it. The true things together. Every item on the list had happened, and all of them together were the evening. And I was going to hold them all in the same account rather than organizing them into categories of good and bad. They were all true, and they were all mine, and the record of the evening was the full list. That is how I received it. The dance was on the list. The word done was on the list. The 80 guests and the 3 cycles were on the list. All of it mine. Also, one more thing about the evening that I have not told you. At the end of the night, when the last guests were leaving and Daniel and I were at the door saying good night, Barbara's sister came to me. She is a woman named Margaret, who is 4 years older than Barbara, and who has a manner that is direct and specific and that I have always appreciated. She said, Sophie. She took my hand. She said, I want you to know that I was in the cocktail room this evening. I said, I know. She said, I want you to know that I spoke to Barbara this week before the wedding and told her that whatever she was planning was not going to change anything and was only going to damage her relationship with Daniel. I said, you knew she was planning something. She said, I suspected. She said, Barbara has been grieving the version of Daniel's life that did not happen for 4 years. She said, I told her the grieving was hers to do privately, and that the wedding was not the place for it. She said, I am sorry that she did not hear me. I said, thank you for telling her. She said yes. She held my hand for a moment. She said, the dance was lovely. I said, thank you. She went to find her coat. I stood at the door. Barbara's own sister had known, had warned her. The warning had not been enough. All of that is in the account. All of it true. Let me tell you where things are now, 1 year later, because this is the anniversary week, and I have been thinking about the word done and what it has meant across 12 months, and I want to give you the full account. Daniel and Barbara have a relationship. I want to be clear about that. The relationship exists. It is structured differently than it was before the wedding, and the structuring has been done by Daniel with what I can only describe as a specific and careful and unhurried clarity. They speak on the phone every 2 weeks. The calls are 30 minutes. They see each other 4 times a year. Christmas, her birthday, his birthday, one Sunday in summer. The structure was Daniel's idea. He had proposed it 6 weeks after the wedding. He had called her and he had said, I want to establish a rhythm. He had said, here is what I am proposing. She had said, 4 times a year. He had said, yes. She had said, that feels like a punishment. He had said, it is a structure. He had said, structures are not punishments. He had said, this is a manageable and sustainable level of contact for where we are right now. He said, the structure can change over time in either direction. He said, but right now this is where I am. She had said, and Sophie. He had said, Sophie is my wife. He had said, the relationship is with both of us, or it is with neither. She had said nothing for a moment. Then she said, all right. The first Christmas had been careful. Careful in the specific way of people who know they are being watched by themselves and each other. Barbara had given me a gift. A book I had mentioned once 6 months before the wedding. She had remembered it. I had thanked her. She had said, I remembered you saying you wanted to read it. I said yes. She said, I hope it is good. I said, I'm sure it will be. It was. I do not know what to do with that. I am not doing anything with it. It is in the box with the wedding photos and the dried flowers, and the card she sent 2 weeks after the wedding that said, I hope we can have a fresh start. The card with the bookmarker in it now. She remembered the book. The things I do not understand about her sit beside the things I understand very clearly. I am holding both. Daniel is watching me hold both. He is doing the same. The record of the wedding is the things that happened, and the things that did not happen. What happened? The ceremony, the photographs in the September light, the best man's camping story, my brother's toast, the slow dance at the end of the night in the middle of the floor, the word done in the corridor, the USB in Daniel's hand. What did not happen? The 8 pages, the photograph on the projector, the 6 mentions of Melissa by name, the line about the direction his life takes. All of that was prepared and none of it happened. It is in the bin in a hotel room. The dance is in the photographs. The toast is in my memory and in a video on my phone. The word done is the word I hear when I think about what is true about Daniel, and what was true in the corridor and what has been true across 12 months of a structured and careful and real beginning. That is the record. That is the whole account. Here is my question for you. If your Mel had secretly prepared 8 pages of a speech including 6 mentions of your husband's ex, arranged a photograph for the projector, and added photos of the ex to your wedding slideshow, and none of it had happened because your husband found out first, would you have kept the 8 pages or put them in the bin? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.